In 1847, on a hillside in what is now Kyrgyzstan, a man who called himself the last Khan of the Kazakhs was captured and executed. His head was severed and sent to the Russian authorities as proof of death. His name was Kenesary Kasymov, and for 10 years he had led the most sustained resistance movement against Russian imperial expansion in Central Asia. This wasn't a single battle or a brief uprising. It was a decade-long struggle that united Kazakhs from all three traditional divisions of their society, challenged both Russian and Kokand authority, and attempted to restore a political order that Russian administrative reforms were systematically dismantling. Yet Kenesary's rebellion ended not with Russian troops defeating him in battle, but with another Central Asian people, the Kyrgyz, killing him while he sought their alliance. This is the story of Kenesary's Rebellion, an attempt to preserve Kazakh autonomy that reveals how empires don't just conquer territory, they dismantle entire ways of life.
To understand Kenesary's rebellion, we need to understand what the Kazakh Khanate was and how Russian power gradually dismantled it. The Kazakh Khanate emerged in the mid-15th century as various Turkic and Mongol groups in the Central Asian steppe coalesced under leaders claiming descent from Genghis Khan. By the 18th century, the Khanate had divided into three administrative divisions called Jews, or hordes. The Junior Jews in the west, the Middle Jews in central Kazakhstan, and the Senior Jews in the southeast. Each Jews had its own Khan, though powerful figures occasionally exercised authority across multiple Jews. The most significant of these leaders was Ablai Khan, who ruled the Middle Jews from 1771 to 1781. Ablai navigated between Russian pressure from the north and Qing Chinese power to the east, playing both empires against each other to preserve Kazakh autonomy. He never fully submitted to either power, maintaining independent foreign relations and military forces. Under Ablai, the Kazakh Khanate functioned as a genuine polity, collecting taxes, organizing military campaigns, conducting diplomacy, and administering justice according to customary law. But Ablai's balancing act only worked because Russian and Qing interests elsewhere prevented them from committing full resources to controlling the steppe. Russian attention was divided between European conflicts, expansion into the Caucasus, and managing internal governance. The Qing had just finished conquering the Dzungar Khanate to Kazakhstan's east in 1759 and were consolidating control over Xinjiang. Both empires accepted Kazakh nominal submission without insisting on actual administrative control. This situation changed after Ablai's death in 1781. His sons lacked his political skill and authority. The Khanate fragmented as different members of the Jinggisid nobility competed for power. Russian policy shifted from tolerating autonomous Khans to systematically replacing them with direct administration. In 1822, the Russian Empire promulgated the Charter on the Siberian Kyrgyz. Russians called Kazakhs Kyrgyz at this time, confusing them with the Kyrgyz people to the south. This reform abolished the position of Khan in the Middle Jews entirely. Instead of a Khan with hereditary authority, the territory was divided into administrative districts called okrugs, each headed by a senior sultan, chosen from the Kazakh nobility but approved by Russian authorities. These sultans had limited powers compared to traditional Khans. They administered Russian policy rather than making independent decisions. Below the okrugs were volosts, administrative units, and auls, village-level units. Local Kazakh elders retained some authority, but ultimate power rested with Russian officials. The reforms also restricted nomadic movement. Kazakhs needed permission to migrate seasonally with their herds, disrupting pastoral economy patterns that had existed for centuries. In 1824, similar reforms were imposed on the junior Jews through the regulations on the Orenburg Kyrgyz. Khan Shirgazi, the last Khan of the junior Jews, was summoned to Orenburg and informed his position was abolished. The junior Jews was divided into 3 districts, each headed by appointed officials. These administrative changes had profound economic and social effects. Russian forts expanded deeper into the steppe, restricting traditional migration routes. Cossack settlements occupied grazing lands. Russian and Cossack authorities collected taxes that traditional Khans had never imposed. Trade increasingly flowed through Russian-controlled channels rather than following traditional steppe networks. Most critically, the reforms destroyed the traditional political structure without replacing it with anything that addressed Kazakh concerns. The sultans appointed by Russians had formal authority but limited legitimacy among their own people. Disputes that customary law and Khan's courts had previously resolved now required Russian approval. The reforms weren't designed to govern Kazakhs effectively. They were designed to eliminate independent Kazakh political power. Kenesary Kasymov grew up watching this transformation. Born in 1802, he was Ablai Khan's grandson through his son Kasim. The Kasymov family remembered when Kazakhs had governed themselves. They saw Russian administrative control as illegitimate theft of their grandfather's legacy, and they weren't the only ones who felt this way.
The rebellion didn't start with Kenesary. It began with violence against his family. In the 1830s, tensions between Kazakh nobles and Russian authorities intensified. Several of Ablai Khan's descendants attempted to assert traditional authority in defiance of the new administrative system. Russian officials responded by supporting rival Kazakh factions, playing different noble families against each other. Kenesary's brother Sarjan was killed in 1836, likely murdered by rivals backed by Russian authorities. Another brother, Geldi, was also killed. Their father, Kasim, died in 1837 under circumstances that Kazakh sources suggest were suspicious. Whether these deaths were coincidental or represented a systematic Russian effort to eliminate the Kasim family is unclear. Sources differ. But Kenesary believed his family was being targeted for elimination because they refused to accept the new order. In 1837, Kenesary took direct action. He gathered followers and began attacking Russian administrative posts, Cossack settlements, and Kazakh officials who cooperated with the Russians. His younger brother, Naurozbai, joined him as a military commander. The rebellion began in the Middle Zhuz, where the Kasim family had the strongest connections. Initial Russian response was limited. Colonial authorities had dealt with Kazakh resistance before and expected this to be another localized disturbance that could be suppressed with punitive expeditions. They underestimated both Kenesary's political skill and the depth of Kazakh grievances. Kenesary framed his movement in explicitly restorationist terms. He demanded restoration of the Khanate boundaries that existed under Ablai Khan. He insisted on the abolition of Russian administrative districts. He called them sofas in his letters, a derogatory term. He demanded Russian forces withdraw from the steppe and return confiscated lands. He wanted recognition as legitimate Khan of the Kazakhs. In 1841, at a Kurultai, traditional assembly of Kazakh leaders, Kenesary was formally proclaimed Khan. The ceremony followed traditional Kazakh practices. He was raised on a white felt cloth, a ritual symbolizing elevation to supreme leadership.
Representatives from all three Zhus attended, though not all Kazakh leaders submitted to his authority. This proclamation was crucial. Kenesary wasn't just leading a rebellion, he was claiming to restore legitimate Kazakh statehood. In his letters to Russian officials and to Tsar Nicholas I, he presented himself as a sovereign ruler negotiating with another sovereign power, not a rebel subject requesting mercy. Russian authorities refused to recognize his claims, but they also couldn't ignore him. By the early 1840s, Kenesary controlled or influenced large portions of central and northern Kazakhstan. Russian punitive expeditions achieved tactical successes, but couldn't decisively defeat him. He would engage when advantageous, withdraw when threatened, and reappear elsewhere. His mobility, a traditional nomadic military advantage, frustrated Russian commanders accustomed to fighting set-piece battles against fixed positions.
Between 1841 and 1844, Kenesary's movement reached its greatest extent. He controlled territory stretching across much of modern northern and central Kazakhstan. He commanded forces that various sources estimate between 10,000 and 20,000 fighters, though numbers fluctuated as different clans joined or withdrew. His success derived from several factors. First, he exploited genuine grievances. The Russian administrative reforms had disrupted traditional life without providing alternatives that worked for pastoral nomads. Taxes were collected, but the revenues didn't benefit Kazakh communities. Land was restricted, but no compensation was offered. Russian and Kazakh settlers occupied prime grazing areas. Many Kazakhs saw Kenesary as defending their way of life. Second, Kenesary demonstrated political flexibility. He understood that different Kazakh clans had different interests. Some resented Russian control, but feared disrupting trade relationships. Others wanted revenge for specific injustices. Kenesary tailored his appeals to different audiences. He could be conciliatory with clans that hesitated to commit fully, harsh with those who actively collaborated with Russians, and strategic in building coalitions. Third, he opened a second front against the Kazakh Khanate. Kokand, based in the Fergana Valley, had been expanding into southern Kazakhstan, building fortresses and collecting tribute. For many Kazakhs, Kokand was as much a threat as Russia. Kenesary attacked Kokand positions in 1841, capturing the fortresses of Janakorgan, Sozak, and Akhmachet. These victories had dual purposes. They removed Kokand as a competing power and demonstrated that Kenesary protected Kazakhs from all external threats, not just Russians. In 1844, Kenesary's forces achieved enough success that Orenburg authorities, who administered much of Russia's interface with the Kazakh steppe, began considering negotiations. There were discussions about recognizing Kenesary's authority in certain territories in exchange for him accepting Russian suzerainty in others. These negotiations never produced results. The Russian government in St. Petersburg had no interest in legitimizing Kenesary's claims, but the fact they occurred showed how seriously Russian frontier officials took the threat. During this period, Kenesary also attempted diplomacy with other Central Asian powers. He sent envoys to Khiva and Bukhara, the other major Central Asian Khanates, seeking recognition and potential alliances. These missions produced little. Khiva and Bukhara had their own concerns and limited interest in supporting a rebellion that might complicate their relations with Russia.
The rebellion contained internal contradictions that gradually undermined it. First, there was the question of what exactly Kenesary was trying to restore. He invoked his grandfather Ablai Khan's legacy. But Ablai had ruled at a time when Russian and Qing pressure was less intense. The geopolitical situation of the 1840s differed fundamentally from the 1770s. Ablai had maintained Kazakh autonomy through diplomatic maneuvering between empires. Kenesary was attempting to maintain it through military resistance against an empire that now committed substantial resources to controlling the steppe. The conditions that had allowed Ablai's success no longer existed. Second, Kenesary's relationship with different Kazakh groups was complicated. He harshly suppressed Kazakh nobles and clans who sided with Russians or who refused to support him. Sources describe him executing Kazakh sultans he considered traitors, burning azols that refused to provide troops or supplies, and generally treating resistance within Kazakh society as severely as resistance from Russians. This approach was tactically understandable. He needed to demonstrate that collaboration with Russians was dangerous, but it alienated potential supporters and created enemies within Kazakh society itself. Third, the campaign against Kokand created complications. While many Kazakhs appreciated Kenesary removing Kokand pressure from southern regions, his attacks also disrupted trade routes and destabilized areas where Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and Kyrgyz lived in proximity. His military operations against Kokand brought him into conflict with various Kyrgyz clans who had relationships with Kokand, creating new enemies. By 1845, Russian military strategy was adapting. Instead of large, punitive expeditions that Kenesary could avoid, Russian commanders established a network of forts that restricted his movement. They armed and supported Kazakh nobles who opposed Kenesary, effectively sponsoring a civil war within Kazakh society. They offered rewards for his capture and targeted his supply lines. Most effectively, they waited. Kenesary's movement required constant military success to maintain support, but the empire could absorb defeats and keep returning with fresh forces. Financial resources became a problem. Traditional Kazakh economy was pastoral, not heavily monetized. Kenesary could collect livestock and supplies from supporters, but he couldn't pay troops regular wages like an imperial army. His forces were volunteers who joined for various reasons: belief in his cause, personal loyalty, hope for plunder, clan obligations. But these motivations weakened when campaigns produced diminishing returns. High-ranking supporters began defecting. Some Kazakh nobles calculated that continued resistance would lead to complete Russian military occupation and loss of whatever limited autonomy they still had under the administrative reforms. Others accepted Russian bribes and promises of protection. By 1846, the coalition that had supported Kenesary at his peak was fragmenting. Russian forces pushed him progressively westward and southward, out of his core territories in central Kazakhstan. He still commanded forces capable of military action, but he was increasingly operating on the margins rather than from a position of strength. His options were narrowing.
In 1846, with Russian military pressure intensifying and his position in central Kazakhstan becoming untenable, Kenesary made a decision that would prove fatal. He moved south into Jatasu, Semerichi, the region bordering Kyrgyz territories. His reasoning appears to have been strategic. Jatasu was less directly controlled by Russia,
It was more distant from major Russian forts. It bordered territories where Kokand, the Kyrgyz Khanates, and China all had interests, creating a complex political landscape where he might find room to maneuver. And, perhaps most importantly, he hoped to form an alliance with Kyrgyz leaders against both Russian and Kokand expansion. In spring 1846, Kenesary sent ambassadors to Orman Khan, the leader of the Sary tribe and the most powerful Kyrgyz chief in the region. Kenesary's proposal was straightforward: unite against common enemies. Russia threatened both Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. Kokand had ambitions in both their territories. Together they could resist these encroachments. Separately, they would be conquered piecemeal. Orman rejected the proposal. Sources suggest he consulted with tribal elders and concluded that alliance with Kenesary was too risky. Orman had his own complex relationship with Russia, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile, but always pragmatic. Kenesary was a marked man, hunted by Russian forces. Allying with him would draw Russian military attention to Kyrgyz territories. Moreover, Kenesary's demands went beyond simple alliance. He wanted Kyrgyz chiefs to acknowledge his authority as Khan, a claim they had no reason to accept. When diplomacy failed, Kenesary resorted to force. In spring 1846, his forces raided Kyrgyz territories, attacking the Salto and Sary tribes. These raids aimed to compel submission. If the Kyrgyz wouldn't voluntarily join him, he would force them to accept his authority. This decision was strategically catastrophic. It transformed potential allies into definite enemies. It confirmed Russian arguments that Kenesary was simply a violent troublemaker whose defeat would benefit everyone. And it created a situation where Kyrgyz chiefs had strong incentives to eliminate him. In April 1847, Kenesary raised an army of approximately 20,000 troops, sources vary on exact numbers, and invaded the Chui Valley in what is now northern Kyrgyzstan. He established camp near the village of Maitobe. His apparent intention was to conquer the Kyrgyz tribes and incorporate them into a broader anti-Russian coalition under his leadership. Orman Khan prepared a response. What happened next revealed Orman's considerable military skill. Facing a numerically superior force, Orman employed deception. He divided his troops into small groups and sent them through mountain passes at different locations. At each pass, the soldiers cut down trees, raised dust, and lit multiple campfires, creating the illusion that large reinforcements were arriving from multiple directions. Kenesary scouts reported these movements, leading him to believe the Kyrgyz commanded far more troops than they actually did. With his opponent psychologically off balance, Orman encircled Kenesary's camp at Maitobe and attacked. Early in the battle, Kyrgyz trumpeters created confusion among Kazakh ranks. Jantai, one of Orman's commanders, killed Kenesary's Prince Serin with a lance. Then, two of Kenesary's own sultans, Rustam Aspandiarlu and Sipatai, betrayed him. They fled the field with significant portions of the army, leaving Kenesary with insufficient forces to continue the battle. The remaining Kazakh forces retreated to marshy ground near Maikan, where they made a final stand. The battle was a massacre. Sources claim 32 Kazakh sultans died in the fighting. Kenesary himself was captured alive.
Kenesary was taken to Chukur Sengyal Hill near the Karasu River and executed. The manner of execution followed the brutal logic of the time. He was beheaded. His head was severed from his body, placed in a bag, and sent first to the Russian commander at Omsk, then forwarded to Tsar Nicholas I in St. Petersburg. Why did Orman send the head to the Russians? Sources debate this question, and it remains politically sensitive in Central Asian historiography. From Orman's perspective, the logic was probably straightforward. Kenesary had been a Russian enemy. Delivering proof of his death
demonstrated that Orman was not harboring rebels and removed any pretext for Russian military intervention in Kyrgyz territories. The Russians rewarded Orman handsomely. They gave him gold medals, gold-embroidered robes, a golden saber, and commissioned him as a lieutenant colonel in the Imperial Russian Army. They were grateful to have the problem resolved without committing their own forces. For Kazakhs, the circumstances of Kenesary's death carried multiple bitter ironies. He died not fighting Russians, but fighting fellow Central Asians. He was killed by people he had sought as allies against common enemies. His head became a trophy for the imperial power he had spent 10 years resisting. And his death didn't come through defeat in a heroic last stand against overwhelming Russian forces, but through betrayal by his own subordinates during a battle he shouldn't have been fighting. The immediate aftermath saw the collapse of organized resistance. Kenesary's brother, Naurizbai, was killed in the same period. Other members of the Kasymov family scattered or submitted to Russian authorities. Without Kenesary's personal leadership and charisma, the coalition he had built disintegrated. Various Kazakh nobles who had supported him negotiated terms with Russian administrators, accepting the very system Kenesary had fought to abolish. On August 22, 1847, Kyrgyz and Kazakh representatives signed a peace treaty at Taldykorgan, formally ending hostilities. But this wasn't peace between equal powers. It was submission to the new reality. The Khanate Kenesary had tried to restore was finished. Russian administrative control expanded across all Kazakh territories over the following decades. In 1867, 1868, comprehensive reforms formalized direct imperial administration, abolishing remaining vestiges of traditional Kazakh political structures. The land itself was declared property of the Russian Empire. Kazakhs became colonial subjects, their pastoral economy increasingly disrupted by Russian and Cossack agricultural settlement. Kenesary was the last person to seriously attempt restoring traditional Kazakh statehood through armed resistance. Later uprisings occurred, most notably the 1916 Central Asian Revolt against Russian conscription during World War I, but none tried to re-establish the Khanate system. The structural transformation of Kazakh society was too far advanced. The Khanate system, whatever its strengths and weaknesses, was gone.
How we interpret Kenesary's rebellion depends heavily on perspective and political context. In Soviet historiography, Kenesary was a reactionary feudal leader, attempting to preserve aristocratic privileges against progressive Russian modernization. Soviet historians emphasized that he had limited popular support, that many Kazakhs opposed him, and that his movement was essentially a failed attempt by displaced nobles to maintain exploitative power over ordinary Kazakhs. This interpretation served Soviet ideological purposes. It justified Russian imperial expansion as historically progressive and delegitimized Kazakh nationalism by characterizing its historical icons as feudal reactionaries. After Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991, historiography shifted dramatically. Kenesary became a national hero, a leader of the first major Kazakh liberation movement against colonial oppression. He appears in modern Kazakh textbooks as a patriot who united Kazakhs across tribal divisions in defense of national independence. There's a monument to him in Astana. His name appears on streets and institutions. This interpretation serves post-Soviet nation-building purposes. It establishes historical precedent for Kazakh statehood and national consciousness. Both interpretations contain elements of truth and elements of exaggeration. Kenesary was fighting Russian colonial expansion, which was indeed dismantling Kazakh political autonomy. His movement did unite Kazakhs from different regions and clans to an unprecedented degree for 19th century resistance. But it's also true that many Kazakhs opposed him or remained neutral. He used violence against fellow Kazakhs who disagreed with his methods. And his stated goal was restoring a Khanate system that primarily benefited the Genghisid aristocracy of which he was a member. The rebellion also raises uncomfortable questions about Central Asian relations. The fact that Kenesary died fighting Kyrgyz rather than Russians complicates nationalist narratives that emphasize solidarity between Central Asian peoples against Russian colonialism. Modern Kyrgyz and Kazakh historians sometimes debate whether Arman acted in self-defense against Kenesary's aggression or whether he treacherously served Russian interests. These debates occasionally surface in contemporary political tensions between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, demonstrating how 19th century events remain politically live in modern Central Asia.
What does Kenesary's rebellion reveal about imperial expansion and resistance? First, it demonstrates how empires dismantle rival political systems through administrative transformation rather than just military conquest. Russia didn't need to fight a massive war to eliminate the Kazakh Khanate. They abolished the position of Khan through legislation in 1822 and 1824, replaced traditional authorities with appointed administrators, restricted movement through new regulations, and gradually squeezed traditional economic and social structures until resistance became inevitable. By the time Kenesary rebelled, the Khanate was already legally dead. He was trying to resurrect something that Russian administrative reforms had already eliminated on paper. This approach to imperial control was more effective than military conquest alone because it created facts on the ground that made restoration progressively more difficult. Every year that passed with the new administrative system in place made it harder to return to the old system. Russian officials, Cossack settlers, and Kazakhs who had accommodated the new system all had interests in maintaining it. Kenesary wasn't just fighting Russian soldiers. He was fighting an entire administrative apparatus and the social transformations it had produced. Second, the rebellion illustrates the extreme difficulty of building coalitions under colonial pressure. Kenesary needed unity among Kazakhs, cooperation from other Central Asian peoples, and ideally support from established powers like Khiva or Bukhara. He achieved none of these fully. Kazakhs were divided by clan loyalties, economic interests, and conflicting assessments of whether resistance or accommodation offered better survival strategies. Other Central Asian peoples had their own concerns and saw no compelling reason to risk everything supporting his cause. Established Khanates preferred maintaining their own relationships with Russia rather than backing a rebellion that might draw Russian retaliation. This fragmentation wasn't accidental. It was the product of imperial policy. Russian administrators deliberately cultivated divisions within Kazakh society, supported some factions against others, and created economic dependencies that made resistance costly. They also played Central Asian powers against each other, ensuring no coordinated opposition could form. Kenesary's failure to build lasting coalitions wasn't primarily a personal failing. It reflected the structural barriers imperial policy had created. Third, the rebellion shows how personal leadership both enables and limits resistance movements. Kenesary's personal authority, his family connection to Ablai Khan, and his political and military skills were essential to the rebellion's success. Without him, there probably would have been scattered local resistance, but not a decade-long movement that unified significant portions of Kazakh society. But this dependence on personal leadership also meant the movement couldn't survive his death.
There were no institutional structures that could continue resistance without him. When he died, the rebellion died with him. Fourth, Kenesary's decision to attack the Kyrgyz in 1846-47 reveals how desperation can produce strategic disasters. By that point, he had limited options and was searching for any way to continue resistance. Attacking the Kyrgyz to force them into alliance was irrational from a strategic perspective. It created new enemies, demonstrated weakness rather than strength, and gave Russian authorities convenient propaganda about Kazakh aggression threatening neighboring peoples. But it's understandable as the decision of someone running out of alternatives and grasping at possibilities that might change the trajectory of a losing struggle. Finally, the rebellion raises questions about historical contingency and inevitability. Russian expansion into Central Asia in the 19th century is often described as inevitable, driven by economic interests, security concerns, and imperial competition with Britain. But Kenesary's rebellion demonstrated that this expansion faced significant resistance and required sustained military and administrative effort. If circumstances had been different, if Russian attention had been more divided by European conflicts, if Kenesary had made different strategic choices, if other Central Asian powers had provided meaningful support, the timeline and character of Russian control over Kazakhstan might have been substantially different. The rebellion failed, but its failure wasn't foreordained from the start. It failed because of specific decisions, specific circumstances, and specific power imbalances, all of which could have been different. Understanding why it failed tells us more about the actual mechanisms of imperial expansion than assuming failure was inevitable.